The Russian investigation into the crash that occurred on Wednesday is underway, and they've announced that they found the two black boxes that were in the civilian aircraft. These will provide a feast of information about basically where the flight controls were, the electronics, the verbal radio banter that was going on at the time. The key objective of this investigation will be to find out what happened and conventionally to try and learn lessons for what might be avoid these sort of incidents in the future. They should analyse the wreckage and probably would find that there was some form of explosion and try and work out whether it's from inside the aircraft or outside the aircraft. One of the challenges here, though, bluntly, is this is a Kremlin-sponsored investigation, and almost certainly it was the Kremlin that ordered the aircraft to be shot down. So we're not quite sure whether the conclusion might have already been written before the report was started. As a result, the US is also keen to find out what happened. President Biden says he wants to use intelligence to get to the bottom of what happened. And we heard from the US State Department earlier on today that there was no evidence that surface-to-air missiles were involved in shooting the aircraft down. How did they know that? When if you use a surface-to-air missile, it normally is quite large, it puts out a lot of heat when it's launched and a lot of light. Now, most of the US intelligence, they'll know where these sites are. Satellite imagery will be watching the sites, and they would be able to detect that from space. So what we interpret here is the US have decided that this wasn't a launch of a surface-to-air missile. But the video of the crash of the aircraft quite clearly demonstrates the aircraft had some massive explosion on board, whether from inside or from a missile outside, potentially an air-to-air missile rather than surface-to-air missile. But the truth is, we'll probably never know. But the fallout from this episode continues. Putin signed a decree yesterday that requires all mercenaries to sign an oath of allegiance to the Russian state. But bluntly, there's two issues that remain that are going to be very difficult for Putin to resolve. One of which is the Russian military has not performed well in the war in Ukraine, and they've desperately needed the help of mercenaries. They've delivered the only battlefield success at Bakhmut. The trouble is, in doing so, they're not trained soldiers. They don't follow the law of armed conflict. They've delivered a lot of war crimes and ended up with Putin being indicted with the International Criminal Court. Now, one of the solutions is they want to assimilate these fighters back into the Russian MOD. But these are brutal rebels who will not respond well to the command chain, and they'll be thoroughly disruptive to the MOD. The second issue, of course, is these mercenaries are used overseas to influence in places like Africa. But once again, they're very difficult to control, they're brutal and they're ruthless. And they've needed a brutal and ruthless leader, such as Prigozhin, to keep them under control. So whilst Putin may have solved the problem that was Yevgeny Prigozhin, resolving the fallout from this departure will be a lot more difficult to do.